I first gave a talk about Beethoven's Grand Ninth Symphony in May 2016 as part of the Stockton Symphony Insights lecture series. This was ahead of its performance by the Stockton Symphony at that season's finale. On that occasion, due to time constraints, I had to overlook large sections of the work. In this podcast, I will rectify this problem. Due to the magnitude of the work, I will divide Beethoven's Ninth into two talks. Part 1 that you're listening to now is on movements 1 through 3. Part 2 will be devoted entirely to movement 4, the choral movement. Any concert featuring Beethoven's Ninth is not just a performance, it's an event. It's a great spectacle with an orchestra, huge chorus, and 4 soloists on stage, and a symphony with a running time of around 80 to 90 minutes. I will open the talk with a quote from Professor Robert Greenberg, who said, quote, "Beethoven's Ninth, without argument, is the single most influential piece of European music written in the 19th century and the most influential symphony ever composed." Unquote. Big words. The most influential ever? Indeed so. Let's first put the Ninth within a historical context by discussing the evolution of the symphony as a genre. The symphony had humble beginnings in the 15th and 1600s, when the term symphonia referred to instrumental introductions or interludes in vocal works such as operas, oratorios, or cantatas. In the mid-1700s, symphonia pulled anchor and became independent instrumental works, usually of 3 movements. These were the prototypes of the symphony as we know it today. In the central German town of Mannheim, an awesome orchestra existed, led by Johann Stamitz, 1717 to 1757. It had a reputation for unparalleled virtuosity. There, the symphony evolved into a 4-movement genre, Stamitz inserting a minuet movement into the lineup. This became the precursor of the classical era symphony. Many, now mostly unknown composers followed with their own symphonies. Remember that in those days, opera was the highest form of musical expression. It was the equivalent of the movies, TV, rock concerts combined, the most exciting form of entertainment. Symphony was still a lowly genre. In the late 1700s, what is now known as the classical era of Western concert music, Haydn and Mozart created a body of symphonies that became the classical era model for the genre. The young Beethoven, then a hotshot concert pianist, followed in their footsteps with his first 2 symphonies, which today are considered classical. In the first decade of the 1800s, Beethoven, in what is known as his heroic period, began elevating the genre. Beginning with his Symphony No. 3, Eroica, the music became lengthier, more elaborate, and more expressive. The Romantic era was now on. In this decade, Beethoven put out symphonies 3 through 8, each exploring different expressions for the genre, each a milestone. Yet symphony remained an instrumental genre as it had been since its origin in the 1500s. From 1815 onwards, Beethoven entered a period of compositional drought. He was involved in a prolonged custody battle for his nephew Karl with his brother's widowed wife, and it sapped his energy and creativity. In 1820, after all that was resolved, Beethoven reinvented himself and began a new period of composition composing monumental works. This is when the Ninth, a long-standing idea in the back of his mind, came to fruition. Premiered in 1824, 3 years before Beethoven's death, the Ninth was revolutionary because it included human voices. It elevated the symphony to its greatest height, now in par with opera and equally as exultant. But it did not come easy. Let's say a few words about the gestation of the Ninth and Schiller's poem An die Freude, Ode to Joy. As early as 1793, Beethoven expressed desire to set Friedrich von Schiller's poem An die Freude to music. This poem that became so famous through the Ninth was actually not much of a poem. Schiller himself, a famous poet, playwright, and philosopher, didn't think much of it. The musicologist Kinderman points out that Beethoven, quote, removed all the most obvious references that mark the Ode to Joy as a glorified drinking song, while preserving a series of powerful and direct images with universal social connotations, unquote. Music critic Michael Steinberg agrees and says, Schiller himself did not think much of his Ode to Joy, and who, reading it away from Beethoven's setting, would disagree with him? An die Freude, Ode to Joy, was first published in 1785. Beethoven subsequently became hooked on it in 1793. A second, shorter version was published in 1803. Beethoven used this later version for his Ninth. Schiller's 1803 poem had 16 stanzas and 96 lines. Of those, Beethoven selected and reordered 36 lines, turning the mundane poem into a major classic when he set it to music. As Beethoven contemplated how to create a choral symphony, and let me tell you that he had major doubts about it before, during, and after, he had a problem, as Michael Steinberg puts it, how to get into the finale, write a passage that would justify the unprecedented introduction of the human voice in a symphony. Beethoven's assistant, Anton Schindler, describes a eureka moment in 1823. Beethoven showed him a sketchbook with the words, "Let us sing the song of the immortal Schiller, Freude," whereupon a solo voice begins the hymn of joy. We will discuss how Beethoven solved the problem of transitioning from instrumental to human voice in some detail in part 2 of this podcast as we examine this historic fourth movement. Let's now say a few words about the history of the symphony. Beethoven's Ninth premiered on May 7, 1824 in Vienna. Beethoven, by then deaf, stood on stage, turned pages of the score, and beat time. But the real conductor was Michael Umlauf. While the premiere was well received, the concert was financially unsuccessful. A second performance was poorly attended. The musicologist Donald Tovey points out that afterwards Beethoven had no doubt, in a moment of depression, said to some friends that the choral finale was a mistake, and that perhaps he might someday write an instrumental finale. There were many in the 19th century who agreed. The musicologist Webster says, quote, "The introduction of text and voices into a symphony was widely felt to violate the spirit of absolute music," unquote. On an interesting aside, the score was published in 1826 with a dedication to King Friedrich Wilhelm of Prussia. Beethoven sent the king a handsome copy of the score and, in recognition, received a diamond ring back. The diamond was false. Beethoven's friends had a hard time persuading him not to send it back. Let us now have a preliminary discussion of the meaning of the ninth. The best summary was made by Kinderman, whom I've quoted before. Kinderman said, quote, "The Ninth Symphony has become an unsurpassable model of affirmative culture, embodying as it does a mythic narrative that depicts inescapable problems of modern life and envisages a potential solution." Unquote. The ninth is a victory symphony moving from D minor to D major. Victory or catharsis symphonies are quite common in the Romantic era. The idea of a negative emotional place in the beginning moving to positive in the finale makes for a popular narrative. Beethoven had already employed this narrative in his famous Fifth Symphony, C minor to C major. We can consider the fifth an individual catharsis, while the ninth is universal. Professor Greenberg points out that there is what he calls the triumvirate of keys in the ninth. We will be talking quite a bit about key areas as we examine the music. Let's set the stage for these. The predominant key areas of the ninth are D minor, the key of despair, B flat major, the key of heroic struggle, and D major, the key of triumph. A bit more on D minor. Musicologist Lockwood says, associated with despair and especially with turbulence, D minor had been a powerful key for Mozart. This may have influenced Beethoven to use it. He rarely did so in his compositions prior to the ninth. The overall plan of the symphony is in 4 movements. The first movement, Allegro ma non troppo un poco maestoso, is in sonata form. The second movement, Molto vivace presto tempo e scherzo, is a scherzo. The third movement, Adagio molto cantabile andante moderato, is the slow movement. The fourth movement, the finale, is a cantata. That's the Ode to Joy. We will begin with Movement 1. Movement 1 is in sonata form with an exposition, development, recapitulation, and a coda that is essentially a second development section, typical of Beethoven. It is in the key of D minor. The movement begins quietly with a brief introduction. 2 falling notes, A and E, are repeated in horns and strings with a pianissimo pulsating accompaniment. These notes, separated by an interval of 5, form what's called an open fifth. The open fifths become more frequent. More instruments enter. Falling D and A pairs, open fourths, also appear. The music rises in a crescendo and leads to theme 1. Let's listen to this introduction. Open fifths. Crescendo. Note that the aura of the music is one of awakening or creation. Kinderman said about this introduction, "The opening of the Ninth Symphony has no parallel in Beethoven's earlier symphonies. It takes its origins from a rapport with silence." I will repeat that, from a rapport with silence. Out of the sphere of the inaudible to that of the audible. This introduction will demarcate the various sections of the movement. In other words, you'll hear this ta-da between exposition and development, development and recap, and at the beginning of the coda. If you get lost in the music, this intro is a good beacon to reorient you. Note that the short, long rhythmic signature of the note pairs, ta-da, will be prevalent in the rest of the movement and appear in other movements. Also note that the introduction is tonally ambiguous. No firm key area has been stated yet. The two notes imply chords of multiple different keys. The crescendo at the end of the introduction leads to a powerful theme 1, fortissimo and in unison in the whole orchestra. The theme is clearly in D minor. It has irregular phrasing. The first phrase is loud and heroic with accompanying timpani rolls. A rising antecedent derived from the open fifths of the introduction is answered by a martial consequent. The second phrase is an interlude with 3 loud, rising orchestral chords sequenced once, followed by a brief fall. The third phrase is a brass fanfare with a distinct rhythm alternating with a quiet, 3-note, chorale-like music in horns. Note that this brass fanfare rhythm will be another recurring element in the movement. At the end, the music dramatically rises and suddenly dissolves in a rapid, down-spiraling passage. We will now hear this, beginning with the introduction and continuing through the entire Theme 1 complex. Introduction. Phrase 2. Phrase 3. Theme dissolves. Next, something unusual happens. The introduction returns and a new version of Theme 1 is presented. Let's listen to this new version and ask ourselves, is this the same Theme 1 as the one we just heard? Introduction. Theme 1, new version. No, it's not the same. It is in the key of B-flat major, and it is truncated, featuring the powerful first phrase antecedent and consequent, followed by a passage that derives from the consequent and develops it. The presentation of a first theme in 2 different keys back-to-back is unusual and makes us wonder what Beethoven is up to. What he's doing, of course, is introducing B-flat as one of the 3 main key areas of the symphony, the key of heroic struggle, from very early on. After a brief modulating bridge, we move on to Theme 2. Theme 2 is not one tune, but a complex of various tunes. The key is B-flat major. The classical era procedure would have called for F major. We first hear a melody marked Dolce by Beethoven. It is smooth and lyrical. This melody anticipates the famous Ode to Joy melody of the fourth movement. Then, winds play a rising tune derived from the preceding Dolce melody with strings and staccato accompaniment. The passage is like a mini development of the Dolce melody. After a brief wind interlude, a passage of rising and falling scales derived from the modulating bridge is repeated twice. Finally, forceful fanfares derived from the last phrase of theme 1 alternate with quiet winds. A slow interlude now comes along, leading to the closing section, first in winds, then descending strings. Let's hear the theme 2 complex. Dolce melody. Second phrase. Wind interlude. Third phrase, rising and falling scales. Fourth phrase, fanfares derived from theme 1. Slow interlude. Let's now go back to the beginning of theme 2 complex and demonstrate the foreshadowing of the Ode to Joy. We will hear the Dolce melody, the first phrase of theme 2, and the Ode to Joy back to back. Theme 2 Dolce melody. Ode to Joy. Incidentally, Beethoven has another foreshadowing of the Ode to Joy, this one in his third movement trio theme. Here it is. The exposition ends with a closing section in the key of B-flat major. It is a complex of various musical ideas, and it ends with a new theme derived from the brass fanfare of theme 1. This will demarcate endings. Let us now hear the entire exposition. I will point out the various sections. Introduction. Crescendo leads to theme 1 in D minor. introduction restated. Crescendo to theme 1 in B-flat major. Modulating bridge. Theme 2, preview of Ode to Joy. Theme 2 is still continuing. End of theme 2. Quiet interlude. Closing section begins. Closing theme. A word about exposition repeat. Beethoven does not call for an exposition repeat. Classical sonata form procedure called for exposition repeats, and so did Beethoven in his other symphonies. Here, he does not. The exposition is long enough and complex enough that a repeat is not necessary. Development. The development begins with a recall of the quiet introduction. Unlike in the beginning, this music remains placid and static, with drone harmonies. The development then unfolds in 2 large chapters, as Michael Steinberg puts it. It is largely concerned with theme 1 and the closing theme. In the first chapter, after the introductory material, the martial closing theme bursts out, followed by a wind chorale based on theme 1. Then we hear a wistful version of the powerful theme 1 first phrase. It reveals a different, unexpected facet of this tune and leads to another climax on the martial closing theme. It ends with the wind chorale and anticipatory music. Let's hear this first part of development. Introductory material repeated. Closing theme bursts out. Wistful version of theme 1. Closing theme bursts out. Wind chorale. Anticipatory music. The second chapter of the development is a massive fugue. It's a triple fugue. It is dramatic and turbulent. It is based on theme 1 motives, and it propels forward with rhythmic momentum. It does not let up, getting louder and more agitated. This fugue, in a way, is a foreshadowing of massive fugues to come in the choral fourth movement. The development continues with calmer music that presents another wind chorale, a plaintive version of theme 2, and music based on theme 2. In preparation to recapitulation, the music then dramatically mounts a crescendo amid a big orchestral descent, with the harmony changing to imply D minor. Before we hear this and the recap, I would like to remind you how the movement started. Remember that we had a quiet introduction that Kinderman called a rapport with silence, but then led to the dramatic first phrase of theme 1 after a crescendo. Here it is again. This introduction now returns in a most dramatic fashion, fortissimo, with ferocious, teeth-rattling timpani rolls in D major. Yes, folks, you heard it right, D major. Theme 1 erupts with the brass blaring out the antecedent and consequent of the first phrase, then in D minor. The music quickly falls back to D minor. Music continues, loud and tragic, with a developmental extension of this material. So let's hear this dramatic recapitulation. We'll hear the end of development crescendo on the orchestral descent, the fortissimo return of the introduction in D major, and then theme 1 in D minor. Orchestral descent. Introduction in D major. Note timpani rolls. Theme 1. Amazing. Whoever would have thought that that quiet introduction had such explosive potential? The musicologist Sir Donald Tovey says about this recapitulation, instead of a distant nebula, we see the heavens on fire. The recap continues with a varied presentation of the theme 2 complex and a verbatim repeat of the closing material. Note that classical era recapitulations were mostly verbatim repetitions of the exposition, now entirely in the home key of the movement. This one is not. Michael Steinberg points out that in the recapitulation, while, quote, revisiting something of the exposition, Beethoven sheds new light on every element and every event, unquote. It is an early example of a recapitulation conceived as a dramatic reinterpretation of the opening of the work, says Kinderman. As the Romantic era progressed and we got to the end of the 1800s, this sort of recap would become the norm. Also note that the all too brief yet dramatic appearance of the introductory material in loud D major key anticipates the triumphant finale of the symphony. Now, the first phrase of theme 2, the dolce precursor of the Ode to Joy, also appears in D major. Sir Donald Tovey interprets the D major dolce passage as, quote, a powerful expression of tragic irony, unquote, for it makes but a fleeting appearance to be swallowed up in the D minor pathos at the end of the movement. Yes, folks, it's too early for the catharsis to take place. Beethoven is enticing us here with a bit of D major in the recap. The closing section ends firmly in D minor. The coda that follows reinforces the D minor in a major way, for, among other musical gestures, Beethoven saves a most dramatic one for the finale of the movement. The coda is a second development section. Toward the end, we hear anticipatory music. It sighs. It slows. Something important is about to take place. Then we get a funeral march. Yes, a funeral march in D minor. It is derived from theme 1. How much more emphasis can you place on D minor than that? Note that this march has a descending chromatic bass, funereal music. As the funeral march rises in a slow crescendo and more instruments join in, the chromatic bass rises to the surface, dominating the entire orchestral texture. It leads to a series of fortissimo chords. The overall effect of this music is one of deep pathos. The movement ends on a definitive fortissimo restatement of the first phrase of theme 1 in D minor, the antecedent, followed by two loud rising D minor scales. The final dramatic gesture is the consequent of the phrase. Let's hear the end of the coda and the end of the movement. Anticipatory music. Music sighs. Funeral march. Chromatic bass rises. Chromatic bass takes over. Theme 1 antecedent. D minor scales. Theme 1 consequent. In conclusion, going back to Kinderman's comment about the meaning of the ninth, the first movement states the inescapable problems of modern life and has a downer ending. While we get glimpses of heroic B-flat major and triumphant D major, the movement is firmly anchored in D minor, the key of despair, and it ends with a firm affirmation of this notion in that dramatic funeral march. The second movement will also explore the dichotomy of D minor versus D major, but in a very different way and with a different ending, giving us a sense of light at the end of the tunnel. The second movement is a scherzo. It has a ternary structure, A, B, A. It utilizes both keys, D minor and D major. The movement begins with a brief introduction. It consists of downward arpeggiated D minor triads, syncopated and with dotted rhythm repeated 4 times, the third as a timpani roll. It has a unique rhythmic signature, ta-ta-ra, 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 and this rhythm will pervade the scherzo section of the movement. About this introduction, Kinderman points out, quote, "The falling fourths and fifths of the opening of the first movement are mimicked in the opening fanfare of the scherzo," unquote. Note the use of the timpani as an important musical instrument, not just a drum. We will have more to say on this later. Let's hear this introduction. Beethoven provides us with 2 versions of the scherzo. They both begin with a quiet fugato, mini fugue, polyphonic music, and then rise into loud, heroic, homophonic statements. In this movement, we get treated to Beethoven's various rhythmic manipulations, one of his famous idiosyncrasies. The first scherzo is in 3/4 meter, triple meter, with 4 beats per measure. The initial fugato is based on the introduction and carries its rhythmic signature incessantly, ta-ta-ra, ta-ta-ra, ta-ta-ra. The mini fugue is in 4 parts, in strings, going from high to low strings in successive imitative entries. Then, more and more instruments join in as the music rises and the polyphony coalesces into a dramatic, loud, homophonic theme with a strong rhythmic drive. Introduction. Fugato. Crescendo to loud homophonic theme. The scherzo also features a second theme and codetta, a mini coda, that I'm not playing for you. The second version of the scherzo is a more elaborate, extended variation of the first. The fugato in this one is in winds and is in 3 parts. Beethoven famously marked this section ritmo di 3 battute, rhythm of 3 beats, in the score. Each measure contains 3 beats per measure rather than 4, giving the music a new rhythmic drive. Notice that after the winds begin, the timpani interrupts them with 4 consecutive rolls, each 4 beats per measure. It's as if the timpani is trying to correct the rhythm. This again is an important role for the timpani, previously an unimportant instrument. Nonetheless, the fugato continues in 3 beats in other instrument groups in a developmental passage. The homophonic version of the theme is also in variation, louder and more heroic and extended. Ritmo di 3 battute. Timpani 4 beats per measure. Fugato continues, ritmo di 3 battute. Crescendo towards the homophonic theme. The middle section, the trio, is, as per tradition, lowly instrumented compared to the scherzo, although it is never 3 instruments. In the trio, Beethoven continues with his rhythmic manipulations, switching from 3/4 triple meter to 2/2 duple meter. The way he achieves this transition is nowadays called metric modulation, a procedure common in jazz. In Beethoven's time, it had no name. The metric modulation occurs in a passage based on the fugato theme. Beethoven marks it stringendo il tempo, speed up. It is sort of like Star Trek. Scotty, warp speed, and voila, we're in a new universe. The first trio theme is a shepherd's tune in oboes and clarinets, accompanied by staccato bassoons. It is in D major, and it closely resembles the Ode to Joy. As in the first movement, theme 2, Beethoven foreshadows the 4th movement. We then hear a second theme, a lush, lyrical string melody, also in D major. Let's hear these. Transition to trio, metric modulation. Trio first theme. Second theme. After the trio, the scherzo returns as before. The movement ends with a brief but significant coda. It briefly recalls the scherzo and trio themes. The trio is abruptly cut off. A series of loud falling octaves in D major end the movement. Here's the end of the movement. Some final comments about the second movement. It begins with a scherzo in D minor, continues with trio in D major, and returns to D minor in the scherzo da capo, the return of the scherzo. In a surprise move, Beethoven then ends the movement in D major in that coda you just heard. He thus advances the narrative of the symphony. Remember the D minor funeral march at the end of the first movement? Things were bleak. Here, at the end of the second movement, there is hope. Note similarities to prior Beethoven symphonies. The dance-like scherzo with its pervasive rhythm, tattara, is reminiscent of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. The pastoral music of the trio is reminiscent of Beethoven's Sixth Symphony. Some scholars consider the pastoral trio as representative of Arcadia, the idyllic version of unspoiled wilderness in Greek mythology, inhabited by noble savages. The overall narrative of the ninth, in this interpretation, involves spiral journey from Arcadia to Elysium, that of Paradise Lost and Regained, according to Maynard Solomon. We'll have a lot to say about Elysium in part 2 of this talk when we get to the Ode to Joy. Finally, a note about the timpani. In the ninth, Beethoven completes what he began in his Fourth Symphony, elevating the stature of the timpani to that of a genuine musical instrument as exemplified by the passages you heard. Professor Greenberg says, what Mozart was to the clarinet, Beethoven is to the timpani. Third movement. This is the slow movement. It is in the key of B-flat major. In this, Beethoven employs a double variations procedure. Two themes are presented and repeated in alternate variation. Towards the end, the procedure breaks down and the music becomes somewhat developmental. The ending, with disrupting fanfares, contrasts with the earlier serenity. The movement begins with a brief introduction in which two-note, stepwise descending motives and strings are echoed by winds. Theme A then unwinds in a leisurely fashion. It is a serene, lyrical song in strings in B-flat major, duple meter, 4/4 time. Each phrase ends with an echo in the winds. Note that the sense of serenity in this music occurs via the leisurely tempo, calm dynamics, and a stable harmony firmly based on B-flat. Here's the introduction and theme A. Introduction. Theme A, first phrase. Echo in winds. Second phrase. Echo in winds. Third phrase. Echo in winds. Last phrase. Echo in winds. After this, we hear transitional music that modulates from B flat to D major. Theme B follows. It is a gorgeous four-square melody in strings and in D major, and it is in triple meter, 3/4 time. This theme is derived from motives presented in the introduction. Note that theme B is also reminiscent of Ode to Joy and is yet another foreshadowing of what's to come. This beautiful melody is immediately repeated. Then some transitional music modulates back to B flat for the theme A variation. It is an extended, more ornamented, dance-like version of the theme with pizzicato string accompaniment, that means plucked. The woodwind echoes of each phrase remained unvaried. We then hear transitional music modulating to G major, followed by the variation on theme B. The melody, tempo, and meter are unchanged. The variation involves a new key, G major, and different orchestration. Sir Donald Tovey remarks, "The scoring is now bright instead of deep." Let's hear this set of variations on themes A and B. Theme A variation. Transitional music. Music modulates to G major. Theme B in variation. Now, a wind chorale based on theme A provides yet another variation on this theme. Toward the end of this chorale, there's a famous passage with a rising melody played by solo horn. The part is assigned to the fourth horn instead of the first, as it should have been. The story is that during the premiere, the fourth horn player showed up with a newfangled horn that had two valves. In those days, horns were valveless. Beethoven assigned the solo part to this player, and since then, tradition has demanded that the part go to the fourth horn. End of chorale. Rising horn, fourth horn. Another variation on theme A follows. After this, the variations procedure breaks down. We hear two sets of loud fanfares, each followed by quieter music, before a more serene coda ends the movement. Here's the first fanfare. This is in E-flat major, followed by serene music based on theme A. And now the second. Louder, more emphatic fanfares, followed by uneasy, pleading music that incorporates the fanfares. What do these fanfares that disrupt the serenity of the music mean? The end of the serene coda features two-note, stepwise descending motive of the introduction, returning in winds, in a quiet passage with a throbbing string accompaniment in B-flat major. We then get some final gestures. The music rises and climaxes in two loud orchestral chords. A serene string chorale follows, one more loud orchestral chord, and then quiet concluding chords in B-flat major. Quiet wind passage with throbbing string accompaniment. crescendo and two loud orchestral chords. Serene string chorale. One more loud orchestral chord. Final concluding chords. Some final comments on this movement. To begin with, as Kinderman points out, slow variation movements employing two themes are characteristic of Haydn but uncommon for Beethoven. The only prominent example is the slow movement of Beethoven's Fifth. The disruptive fanfares towards the end of the movement contribute to a strangely disquieting atmosphere in the coda, says Kinderman. This sets the stage for the Schreckens fanfare, the horror fanfare that will start the fourth movement. For that, you'll have to listen to part 2. Finally, the meaning of the slow movement and the overall narrative of the symphony. Lockwood says, this adagio and its lyrical extensions bring an oasis of peace and contemplation. It signifies arrival at a desirable condition in mortal life, with B-flat, the key of heroic struggle. The fourth movement that employs human voices will now propose a utopian ideal beyond. This movement is a work unto itself and will be discussed in a separate Part 2 podcast. Thank you.